Yes, Victor, please go ahead.
Okay, so I'll start with a brief introduction and then I'll pass the speech to Professor Roberts. Um, Thank you very much, all participants that are watching us. My name is Vitor, and I would like to give you all a warm welcome to a new event organized by the Council of Global Cooperation. The CGC is an international nonpartisan forum aimed at tackling global issues that shape our modern world through independent research, analysis, and open dialogue. The major projects that we have undertaken focus on genocide and disaster studies, international history and foreign policy, Cold War, and Third World studies. And the main goal of this organization is to provide an in-depth analysis, raise public awareness about pressing issues, examine the various crises of our era, and suggest peaceful and effective resolutions for them. In CGC, I serve as the research director for studies of the Third World Vertex, and I am also the program director of the Latin American program, since I'm Brazilian. Today, we are truly honored to host today's Latin America lecture by Professor Roberts. And this lecture is very important to us, and that is the first event organized by CGC Latin American program. After that, the CGC would start its research and commitment to the Latin American region. And thank you again, Professor Roberts. The floor is to you.
Okay.
So thank you, Victor. And it is our great privilege to have you, Professor Roberts. To our audiences, I would like to introduce Professor Kenneth Roberts. Professor Kenneth Roberts is the Richard J. Schwartz Professor of Government and the Faculty Fellow at Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies at Cornell University. His teaching and research interests focus on democracy, comparative politics, the political economy of development, and politics of inequality, with particular specialization on Latin American studies and comparative politics. Professor Roberts' research explores the intersection of political parties, social movements, and populism in Latin America and beyond. He has been a Fulbright scholar at several institutions and a visiting fellow to numerous institutions such as Princeton, the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, Italy, the Stone Center for Latin American Studies at Tulane University, and the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame. His recent publication is the co-edited Democratic Resilience is the co-edited volume Democratic Resilience, Can the United States Withstand Rising Polarization? And his further publications include Changing Course in Latin America, Party Systems in the Neoliberal Era, Deepening Democracy, the Modern Left and Social Movements in Chile and Peru, and the edited volumes, The Resurgence of the Latin American Left and the Diffusion of Social Movements. Professor Roberts has been the Dean for the Social Sciences in Cornell's College of Arts and Sciences, as well as the Director of Cornell's Latin American and Caribbean Studies program. He holds a PhD from Stanford University with a specialization in comparative and Latin American politics. We are greatly honored to have him on our platform today. Today, we also have with us as a panelist our advisory chair to the Latin America program, Ambassador Roberto Laos Vargas, who has been the Mexican ambassador to Austria, Cuba, Bolivia, and to Spain, and who is a distinguished board member to International Women's Forum and COMEXI. Ambassador Vargas today is joining us for a discussion with Professor Roberts on the politics and issues of Latin America. We are greatly honored to have you as well in the panel, Ambassador Vargas. So without further delays, I would like to pass on the floor to Professor Kenneth Roberts for delivering the CGC Latin America lecture with his lecture titled Latin America's New Left Turn in Comparative and Historical Perspective. Over to you, Professor Roberts.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Sumava and Vitor. And I want to Thank you all for inviting me to share with you today and talk a little bit about contemporary Latin America and some of the political challenges the region is facing. So it's nice to be able to share a little bit with you all and to kick off your efforts to try to study the Latin American region. As I get started here, just give me a moment to pull up shared screen so that I can show a few slides. Okay, let's see. Is that showing okay for you all? Can you see it? All right,
Yes,
very good.
perfectly.
Let's see, I need to get into the some reason it's not allowing me. Okay, so let me just start by saying that I want to talk a little bit about what is being referred to in Latin America as the new left turn, sort of a political shift to the left that has taken place, but is in some way a second political shift to the left that the region has seen. In between was a short-lived turn to the right, roughly the years 2015 and 2019. And there's a lot of debate in Latin America as to how we should interpret this. What does it really mean? To what extent is this a basic change in the ground rules of Latin American politics? Or is this simply an expression of the political fluidity or the volatility that exists within the Latin American region? So I want to talk a little bit about those issues today and introduce you to some of the debates that we're having about contemporary Latin American politics. Let me just start with a couple of vignettes. I want to talk about a couple of countries and what they're going through, just to give you a sense as to what some of the debates are and what some of the political events are that we're trying to understand. So let me start with the Chilean case. Chile is often a country that tends to be on the cutting edge of political changes within Latin America. It's kind of a bellwether in many respects for what's happening in the region. But a couple of years ago, 2019, there was a massive social uprising in Chile, a huge protest movement in October of 2019 that was really the latest in a series of uprisings that were triggered by a student protest movement. So it was a sort of a mini uprising in 2006 by high school students, and then a much bigger uprising in 2011 and 2012 by the university students. And in some ways, that set the stage for the 2019 student uprising. The picture on the left that you can see, 1.2 million people on the streets of Santiago in October of 2019, eventually forcing the government to allow the election of a new constituent assembly to rewrite the constitution in Chile. Photo on the right here, this is Gabriel Boric, who is the current president of Chile, but this was Boric when he was a leader of the student protest movement in 2011. So he's a president who came out of the social movements, and the students were basically protesting against the privatization of the Chilean education system and the inequalities that resulted from that. All right, so that's just a couple of slides, or there are a couple of photos showing some of the background in Chile. Eventually, as I mentioned, the government backed down and agreed to the election of a constituent assembly to try to calm things down with the protest movement. The government allowed the election of a constituent assembly last year, and a Mapuche indigenous leader, Elise Loncon, was elected the president of the Constituent Assembly. The assembly wrote a very progressive constitution, recognizing the rights of nature, the rights of indigenous peoples, the rights of women. But then at the end of the day, the constitution was rejected by the Chilean population in a national plebiscite. And so in some ways, Chile, a country that had long been operating under the constitution left behind by the Pinochet military dictatorship, they went through a process of social mobilization and protest that culminated in the writing of a new constitution, but then Chilean voters turned down the new constitution. So it's indicative of what you might think of as a political stalemate within Chile, right? So the country has not decided on a new constitution moving forward. They have elected now a left-wing president, Boric, who comes out of the social movements, and yet he's finding it very difficult to govern the country in this condition of conflict and political stalemate. Another vignette been in the news a lot recently, of course, the big election in Brazil this past October. The incumbent president, Jair Bolsonaro, was very much a conservative political figure. He had a fixed picture here of him with a weapon. He came out of the military and was a staunch defender of gun rights, and as part of an effort to try to crack down on crime and insecurity in Brazil. So he was a very, very much a law and order kind of president. He was running against the former president, Lula, who is a left-wing political figure from the Workers' Party. Lula was the president earlier between 2002 and 2010. He was a two-term president, a very popular president. There's a long story. I'm not going to get into sort of the scandals that emerged within his political party. Eventually, Lula spent a little bit of time in prison on contested corruption charges. He was ultimately released from prison by the Supreme Court, and he was allowed to run for president. And so he ran against Bolsonaro last year in the presidential campaign, and Lula won in a very narrow victory, right? A very close second round election. So the left-wing candidate Lula defeated Bolsonaro. And then, of course, there was a right-wing uprising, essentially an attack on the capital institutions with the supporters of Bolsonaro. You can see here the picture on the left. It says, intervention, calling for a military intervention to block the inauguration of Lula, and basically riots and attacks on the government institutions within the capital of Brasilia. Right, so the supporters of Bolsonaro did not accept the defeat of Bolsonaro in the election. They tried to block the inauguration of Lula, essentially called for the military to intervene and to block the inauguration of Lula. Right? So Brazil's another case. You have a new left-wing president who's been elected, but a very high level of political contestation around the basic rules of the democratic game. Okay. The other case that's been in the news a lot recently is Peru. Peru had elected a left-wing leader a couple of years ago, Pedro Castillo, came from the rural areas, had support from the peasantry and some of the unions, but he was in conflict with the Congress, and Congress was moving to impeach him, and he basically tried to dissolve the Congress so that he could rule without the Congress. And at that point, Congress refused to be dissolved, and they impeached him. So he was removed from office. And in recent weeks, there have been extensive protests by his followers, and there have been quite a few people who have been killed in the police and military repression of the protest movement. So a lot of instability and conflict that is going on in Peru today. These three cases basically, I think, are indicative of the tumultuous times that Latin America is living through. Right? Those are three countries where presidents of the left, presidents have been elected from the left in recent years. And yet what we see is a deepening political polarization in many respects, ongoing conflict in some cases between the left and the right, but ultimately deepening political polarization. There's also been concern in the region about democratic erosion or backsliding. There are several countries in the region, in particular Venezuela and Nicaragua, where you have leftist governments that have become increasingly authoritarian over time. And so a lot of political conflict over the erosion of democracy in those cases. Also a lot of concern in kind of Guatemala in particular about the gradual erosion, actually Guatemala and El Salvador, where you have more conservative governments that have also been moving in a more authoritarian direction in recent times. So there's a lot of concern about the democratic erosion or backsliding. And of course, in the Brazilian case, what you saw were the supporters of Bolsonaro very openly calling for military intervention in the democratic process. A lot of parallels, the kind of social protests or the attack on the Capitol that you saw in Brasilia, very reminiscent of what the United States went through on January 6th after the defeat of Donald Trump in the election, right? In terms of these tumultuous times, we also see heightened electoral volatility in Latin America, all right? So volatile swings in one election, voters supporting the left, and another election, voters supporting the right. So there seems to be just a lot of volatility and a lot of back and forth. And there's certainly a lot of what you might think of as simply anti-incumbent voting, right? So whoever is in office, and especially in a context of the pandemic and economic hardships, you see that incumbent presidents routinely are being defeated just about everywhere in Latin America. So there's a lot of fluctuation and alternation in office that is taking place because of that. Right. Finally, then, as part of these tumultuous times, there clearly has been an electoral shift to the left again the last couple of years. I'll talk a little bit more about that further on. And this is driven in part by social mobilization at the grassroots. Countries like Colombia, Chile, Honduras, you see a lot of grassroots mobilization that lies behind the election of these new left-wing governments. But there seems to be a lot of fragility within these new left-wing governments. And so Boric's popularity has come down quite a bit. In Chile, you saw, of course, that Castillo was impeached. In Peru, Lula took office, but there was an uprising at the Capitol when he took office. And so there is clearly a fragility that underlies this new political shift to the left. So I want to try to help us understand that fragility today. Let me talk by just contextualizing this a little bit. I want to give you a little bit of understanding of the background. How did we get to where we are today within the region? I just want to talk about the historical antecedents that help us put the contemporary left turn in a broader historical context. I think the story probably needs to begin with what are often referred to as the dual transitions of the 1980s. Right? The 1980s was a key moment of political inflection within Latin America. There were macro level political and economic transformations that took place across the 1980s. First of all, a shift from authoritarian rule to political democracy. So you saw the demise of the military dictatorships that predominated in the region in the 1960s and 1970s. By the 1980s, you see in one country after another a transition from authoritarian rule to political democracy over the course of the 1980s. And then the other big macro level change was the shift in the economic development model. All right, so the model of what is often called import substitution industrialization, or essentially state-led economic development. That model ran into crisis in the 1980s, the debt crisis and hyperinflationary pressures in many countries. And in response, Latin America moved towards more of a free market, or what is often called a neoliberal model of economic development over the course of the 1980s and the 1990s. All right, so the neoliberal model really began in Chile under military rule. It began under Pinochet in the 1970s, but it spreads across the rest of Latin America over the course of the 1980s as governments responded to the debt crisis and the inflationary pressures. All right, so this was the period often referred to as the Washington Consensus. All right, the Washington Consensus for neoliberal or free market reforms in the 1990s. This is just a line graph showing different economic indicators: capital account liberalization, trade liberalization, financial liberalization, right, privatization policies. And you see the upward trend line after the mid-1980s, essentially signifying that Latin America is moving towards freer markets in these different economic indicators, especially trade and financial markets, right? So a liberalization of markets and an opening up towards free markets in the 1980s and 1990s in response to the debt crisis. Nevertheless, this Washington Consensus. And it was called the Washington Consensus in part because pretty much all the governing parties bought into it. They had very limited maneuvering space in terms of what they could do in office. And certainly Washington and the US government, as well as the IMF and the World Bank, were strongly pressuring Latin American governments to move in this direction. Right? So essentially all countries within Latin America moved towards freer markets in the 80s and 90s. Nevertheless, the winds begin to shift by the latter part of the 1990s as you start to move towards this first so-called left turn within the region. And essentially, after Latin America defeats hyperinflation, all right, once you get beyond the early to mid 1990s, Brazil really was the last country in the region to defeat hyperinflation in the mid 1990s. Once they defeated hyperinflation, you begin to see the social pressures building up again for governments to do more to respond to what is often called the social question in Latin America, namely the social and economic, the severe inequalities that have always characterized the region. Right? So Latin American countries are among the most unequal countries in the world, and these inequalities became increasingly politicized once the region moved beyond hyperinflation and stabilized their economies. All right, so you see a new politicization of social and economic inequalities. You begin to see a strengthening of leftist political parties in a number of countries. So the PT in Brazil, the Socialist Party in Chile, the Frente Amplio in Uruguay. These are established, basically center-left political parties that are advocating for governments to do more to try to respond to the social and economic pressures in their societies and to try to reduce the inequalities. So you see a strengthening of leftist parties. You also see a revival of mass social protest movements in a number of countries, right? Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, where you had mass protest movements against neoliberal economic reforms, advocating for governments to do more to respond to these problems. And you began to see in these countries the emergence of basically new left populist political parties, not the traditional parties of the left, but new kinds of alternatives. So the rise of Chavismo in Venezuela, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, the Evo Morales and the MAS in Bolivia. So these are new political parties that are basically emerging out of the social protest movements that took place within their countries. And you also get in this time period the rise of new social actors, right? Indigenous movements, community organizations, movements, the so-called Piquetero movement in Argentina of unemployed workers, movements of the urban poor. So what has taken place in the region is during the period of the debt crisis and the neoliberal reforms, there was really a dramatic weakening of traditional labor movements in Latin America. Right? So the labor movements that were at the core of the old populist coalitions, Peronism and the PRI in Mexico and other countries, Acción Democrática, the labor movement in Venezuela, you saw a weakening of the traditional labor movements over the 80s and 90s, but now by the late 90s, you're seeing the rise of new social actors that are beginning to fill the void and that are putting pressures on governments to respond to these deepening inequalities within the region. Right, so the rise of new social actors becomes part of this story. What you see then is the political shift associated with the first so-called left turn. All right, and this really begins with the election of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela in 1998, but it continues through 2014 in 11 different countries, right? 11 different countries in Latin America that elect a president of the left. And in many cases, those presidents or their party successors are reelected as well. All right, so 30 different presidential victories by leftist candidates in 11 different countries from 1998 to 2014. Right, so this is the so-called left turn. Begins in Venezuela, then jumps to Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Paraguay, El Salvador, and Costa Rica. And so this was a period that really there's no there's no historical precedent for this. Never before in Latin America have you seen so many presidents of the left get elected into office and be able to stay in office without getting overthrown in a military coup, right? You've seen historically in Latin America, you might get an elected president of the left. Typically, they were overthrown in a military coup in the past. So this was really unprecedented in the region, that you would get a series of countries electing left-wing presidents who are able to fill out their terms in office, and in many cases to be reelected, right? Several of these leftist governments were reelected 2 or 3 or 4 different times. Okay. Nevertheless, that first left turn basically comes to a crashing halt, the middle of the last decade, right? The demise of the first left turn really beginning, you could argue, with the end of the commodity boom in 2014. I might point out Hugo Chavez, of course, died of cancer in 2013. So for the part of the left that sort of revolved around Hugo Chavez, what is often called the Bolivarian, more radical populist left, they were certainly weakened by the death of Hugo Chavez in 2013. But in 2014, the commodity boom basically comes to an end. And the commodity boom was simply the very high prices for oil and gas, soybeans, copper, different commodity exports that the Latin American countries specialize in. The commodity prices were very high from 2003 till about 2013. And these high commodity prices certainly did not cause the left turn. That's not really what brought the left into power. But I would argue that it helped to stabilize the left turn, and it allowed the governments to be reelected. And in some ways, it probably, prolonged the left turn because these were economic good times. The period between 2003 and 2013 was really the healthiest period economically that Latin America had had since at least the 1960s. All right, so it was a relatively good period economically, but that comes to an end with the changes in the global markets and the end of the commodity boom in 2014. Okay, so the prices that the Latin American countries received on the global markets for commodity exports begin to fall, and this begins to weaken the governments, right? Because some of the countries, they're no longer growing rapidly. Governments no longer have the foreign exchange reserves that they can use for public investments and for social programs. And so what you begin to see is a tightening of the economic constraints on governments, and increasingly you see a weakening of the governments in power. Right? There's also, in addition to the end of the commodity boom, you get corruption scandals in Brazil and a couple of other countries that certainly hurt the left-wing ruling political parties. You also see in a couple of countries the rise of right-wing social protest and political mobilization, right? So you see right-wing protests in Brazil and Bolivia, a little bit in Argentina. And then you get a case like Chile, where you had social protests not on the right, but on the left, but it was really a protest movement that was outflanking the established left, the social democratic left, and outflanking them even more further to the left. And so a number of things that are going on that are beginning to weaken the governments of the left after 2014. This is just a graph that shows the declining oil and commodity prices. And so you can see the plunging of the prices after 2013 and 2014. Right? So this is part of what begins to weaken the governments in this time period. So what you find sort of reflecting back on this first left turn, some of the contradictions and challenges that they faced. Ultimately, these governments were very reliant on windfall commodity profits for economic prosperity and to finance the social programs. So these were really not leftist governments that developed an alternative development model to try to industrialize their economies, for example, as Latin American populist governments did in the last century. These were governments that basically were content to export the commodities that they had, to receive the higher prices, and to use the profits from those revenues for different kinds of social programs. And they did have some success in reducing social inequalities. In fact, the Gini index of inequality in Latin America, which is extraordinarily high, it came down across the region during this period of the left turn, right? So there were some achievements made in terms of reducing extreme inequalities, but the governments were very highly dependent on these windfall commodity profits. And when the commodity boom came to an end, of course, they no longer had those revenues available. So there was very limited new industrialization in the region, very little diversification of Latin American economies. In some ways, the leftist governments doubled down on their dependence on oil and gas and soybeans, the different commodities they were exporting. And ultimately, the industrial sector in Latin America still lacks international competitiveness, right? So the region remains, compared to Asia, for example, Latin America remains highly dependent on commodity exports rather than being able to produce manufactured goods that are competitive in global markets. Right, so the region remains very highly vulnerable to boom and bust cycles in the global economy and what that means for commodity prices. And the region really entered into a deepening recession, or at least a period of economic stagnation after 2014 that is then exacerbated by the pandemic in 2020. The other key failure, I think, on the part of the leftist governments, Latin America is plagued by extraordinarily high levels of crime and violence. And so although the region has come a long way in putting an end to the civil wars and the political violence of the 1970s and 1980s, right? So the civil wars have ended the extraordinary human rights violations you saw under the military dictatorships in the 60s and 70s. That period has largely come to an end. And the levels of political violence in Latin America are much, much lower than they were in the 70s and 80s. But the tragedy is that the levels of criminal violence have increased dramatically, right? So a lot of this, of course, is associated with the drug trade and the narco trafficking of moving drugs from South America up through Central America and Mexico into the United States, right? But the political impact of crime and violence and insecurity is dramatic in many Latin American countries. And the governments of the left really did not have a formula to respond to this that was successful or that was meaningfully different from the governments of the right. So I think the left-wing governments really struggled to develop progressive alternatives to the kind of hard line, what are called mano dura, which means the iron fist, right? Sort of the iron fist policies that right-wing leaders have proposed to deal with crime and insecurity. The left has struggled to come up with a progressive alternative to that. The other problem, I think, with some of the governments of the left that they faced in terms of their political failures, the left had always talked a lot about a new way of doing politics. You know, they talked when they were in opposition, they always talked they were not going to follow the kinds of corruption that are prevalent in the region. They were not going to pursue clientelistic types of governing strategies. They were going to support more popular participation. They were going to deepen democracy. A lot of discourse around this. The PT in Brazil in particular was often seen as a model for trying to understand the new, more grassroots-based participatory mode of governance, because the PT, before they took national power, when they governed at the local level, a lot of innovative experiments in grassroots participation they had been involved in. But ultimately, the PT and the other leftist parties found it very difficult to translate those kinds of participatory experiences into governing strategies at the national level. And indeed, when they governed, it was not obvious to people that they were necessarily a whole lot different from some of the other kinds of governments. The PT itself got involved in corruption scandals at the national level when they were governing in Brazil. So ultimately, I think this was it sort of punctured the myth that the left was going to govern in a different way, or that they had a different way of governing from some of the other political parties, right? So at the end of the day, there was a lot of a heavy reliance on technocratic policymaking in a country like Chile, a reliance on charismatic authority. Lula in Brazil, Chavez in Venezuela, Correa in Ecuador, Evo Morales in Bolivia. So rather than really prioritizing the grassroots participation in the democratic process, what you saw was a lot of dependence upon charismatic leaders. Right, so ultimately then, that first left turn comes to an end starting 2014, 2015, right? It really ends with the election defeat of the left Peronis in Argentina in 2015. This was followed by election defeats in Chile, in Uruguay, and El Salvador. A couple of years later, there was the presidential impeachment of Rousseff, Dilma Rousseff, who was the successor to Lula in Brazil, an earlier impeachment of Fernando Lugo in Paraguay. In Ecuador, the left basically split internally in 2017 and was pushed out of office. In Bolivia, you had sort of a civic protest movement and a military intervention. People debate whether or not it was a coup, but essentially Evo Morales was pushed out in 2019. The countries where the left stayed in power, Venezuela and Nicaragua, they stayed in power basically by becoming increasingly authoritarian. And so ultimately, you saw the left, with this authoritarian retrenchment in Venezuela and Nicaragua, and the left being pushed out of power in pretty much all the other countries within the region. All right, so ultimately, people began to talk about a new right turn. By 2018, 2019, this discussion of a new right turn. You see the map on the left. The countries in red are the countries under some sort of leftist government. The countries in blue under the right. But you see the big change between 2008 and 2018, with the map turning blue by 2018. Nevertheless, this so-called new right turn, which I was never convinced was really a right turn, it was short-lived and quite ephemeral. All right, so you had right-wing governments that take over in Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, most of the region between 2015 and 2019. But this ends up being a very, very short-lived political shift to the right, right? So left-wing parties very quickly returned to power in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and Bolivia. And then you also had a new pattern starting in 2018, where countries that were not part of the original left turn, so Mexico, Honduras, Colombia, and Peru, they have in recent years now elected leftist presidents. Right, so they become part of this new left turn that begins after 2018, although they were not part of the original left turn. Right, so in other words, there's been a new political shift to the left that has taken place starting in 2018 with the election of López Obrador in the case of Mexico. Okay, so there's this short-lived right turn was followed by a new political shift to the left, and you can see what the map looks like today. Some of the countries I'm not entirely sure they have right here, but basically the map has turned very red again over the last couple of years with the new political shift to the left. So the question that a lot of people are asking then, is this new left turn any more resilient? Is this likely to be something that is durable, or is this just another part of the cycling back and forth, what people call the careening, all right, careening between the left and the right? Careening is the notion that, rather than any sort of durable trend, what you have is just this random instability and alternation in office with no clear trend lines. And this kind of careening, I think, is especially likely where you have chronic anti-incumbent voting, right? Where incumbents are unpopular because economies are not performing well, because of corruption scandals. The pandemic certainly played a part of this. Where incumbent governments are unpopular, people tend to vote for whatever the alternative is. And so if you have right-wing presidents in power and the economies are not doing well, people vote for the left, or vice versa. And I think ultimately, it's probably too early to tell whether this new left turn is going to be more resilient or whether it's going to be ephemeral. But I do want to say that I think it's important to recognize it's more than simply a cycle of anti-incumbent voting. Right? It's important to keep in mind anti-incumbent voting is longstanding in Latin America. Right? There have always been patterns of incumbents being unpopular, people being unhappy with the economic situation or with political corruption. So there's a long history of anti-incumbent voting in Latin America that does not produce a political shift to the left. Right? When you have fragmented multi-party systems, the fact that there's anti-incumbent voting does not mean you're going to get a political shift to the left, because you have other alternatives. In the old days in Latin America, If you didn't like what the conservatives were doing in power, you could vote for the liberals or the Christian Democrats. If you didn't like what the Colorados were doing, you could vote for the Blancos. So there were a lot of different alternatives, and there's still a lot of different alternatives. There's nothing automatic about anti-incumbent voting producing a political shift to the left. What has taken place, I would argue, is not so much a durable political shift to the left, but there is, I think, a basic restructuring of political competition along a left-right axis since the turn of the century. And I think this basic restructuring undergirds both the first political shift to the left and the more recent political shift to the left, and indeed the short-lived turn to the right that we saw between 2015 and 2019 within the region. Right? In other words, what has taken place is that in virtually every country in the region now, you have the electoral arena structured by a leftist alternative and a right-wing alternative. And in general, there has been a weakening of the centrist political parties, right? You think back to, the Christian Democrats or Acción Democrática, parties that were basically centrist political parties. They have weakened in most of Latin America. And what you tend to have are alternatives on the left or the right. They may be personalities rather than well-established political parties, or they may be movements rather than well-organized political parties. But I think there has been a basic restructuring of competition along a left-right axis that is different from what we've seen in the region. Historically, Chile always had that. All right, Chilean elections were always structured between a left, a center, and a right. But a lot of Latin American countries, you had two parties. You had the Blancos and Colorados, and they were both conservative, or you had the liberals and conservatives, and they were both conservative. You didn't necessarily have a left and a right. So what has emerged in the region is this basic left-right structuring of politics as a way of undergirding the electoral process. I think it's also important to recognize the political diversity that exists within the new left turn. All right, in some countries, we've seen the return of an established party of the left or the center left. So that'd be the PT in Brazil, the Peronistas in Argentina, the MAS in Bolivia. In other cases, the Mexican case, you have basically a new populist left that has emerged. López Obrador has been around for a while, been competing really since since early in the 2000s, but he finally was elected president in 2018. But essentially, it's a new populist left that has come into power now in the Mexican case. In other cases, in Chile, Colombia, Honduras, these are basically new lefts that have emerged out of social movements. All right, so out of the social protest movements in those countries, it's a new left that is putting a lot of emphasis on women's rights and the environment, as well as economic inequality. Right, so it's a left that is not just politicizing social class or traditional inequalities, but they are challenging traditional social hierarchies on race and ethnicity, on gender, and other issues as well. Right, so this new left coming out of the movements, I should point out there's been a very strong women's movement that has emerged in Argentina, Chile, Colombia, pushing for abortion rights, reproductive rights, and as well as women's rights more generally. So the new left that is emerging in part of the region is quite different from the traditional left, which strongly emphasized social class, right? The working class and labor unions. The new left is a little bit different, a little bit broader in terms of the kind of social inequalities that they are challenging. And then the Peruvian case was a bit of an outlier. Castillo has already been pushed out of office. That was a very weak leftist government to begin with. Castillo was a personalistic figure without a strong political party or a strong social movement to undergird his leadership. It's not terribly surprising he did not last long. So that was kind of the extreme case of a very fragile new left. But of course, what you're seeing now is his supporters are protesting, and indeed a stronger social movement appears to be emerging in the Peruvian case. So ultimately, there is this political shift to the left that has taken place, but there are these underlying fragilities in most of the cases, and there's a lot of variation. All right, a lot of diversity that exists within these different countries, within the left, They're rather different kinds of left that we're seeing come to power. This is just an example, the photo of Brazilian President Gustavo Petro, whose Vice President Francia Marquez is the leader of the women's movement from the Afro-Colombian communities on the Pacific coast of Colombia. So this is a new leftist government that again comes very much out of the social movements and trying to establish itself now as a governing party of the left. Okay. I should also point out, important to keep in mind, there are political changes underway within the right as well within Latin America, including important responses to what is sometimes called the conservative dilemma, right? The conservative dilemma refers to the notion that for conservative political parties whose core base of support are economic elites, it's difficult to win elections if your core base are economic elites. By definition, elites are a small minority, especially in countries like Latin America, where you have extreme inequalities. And I think you find in Latin America that when the right was strongly associated with the neoliberal model, they, increasingly by the 2000s, they were finding it difficult to compete electorally on the basis of the neoliberal platform. All right, so the economic agenda of the right is one that makes it difficult for them to appeal for broad multi-class support. But what you're seeing on the right increasingly is the politicization of cultural issues and cultural identities in ways that allow the right to appeal beyond the economic elites to broader popular bases and popular constituencies. So you see, you see political parties on the right politicizing traditional family structures and gender roles, opposition to LGBTQ rights, politicizing crime and insecurity, so they adopt very tough anti-crime, law and order kinds of platforms. And indeed, there has emerged in recent years, most obviously in the case of Brazil with Bolsonaro, but you see this in Chile with Jose Antonio Cast. There are elements of this emerging in Argentina and Peru and other places as well. But it's the rise of a new populist, sort of a populist radical right that is very staunchly anti-establishment, that tries to appeal to the people against the traditional establishment. They run against corruption, at least in their discourse. That doesn't mean that they're any less corrupt if they come into office. There are all kinds of scandals percolating around Bolsonaro and his family. But they very much run against the party establishment and traditional political leadership, the traditional political parties. They take strong law and order platforms. They appeal to the people on the basis of, trying to, to increase gun ownership or, taking a stand that is very tough on crime. They are very critical of what they call gender ideology, all right? So any sort of feminist ideologies or movements in the countries, strong stands against gay rights. So essentially they're appealing to conservative, evangelical, and Catholic constituencies around traditional kinds of family structures. In some cases, you also see a politicization of middle and upper class resentments of affirmative action. In a place like Brazil, for example, where Lula's earlier governments had tried to expand access for Afro-Brazilians to higher education through affirmative action plans. And you see the right wing politicizing those kinds of efforts to reduce racial and ethnic inequalities. And ultimately, a figure like Bolsonaro or Jose Antonio Cast in Chile, these are right-wing leaders who appeal very openly to right-wing nostalgia for military regimes in the past, in Brazil and Chile. So they emphasize order and security. Bolsonaro himself entered politics after a career in the military, and he retained very strong ties to both retired and active duty military and police officers. And you see some of the tensions around that emerging in the failures of the police to guard against the attack on the Brazilian capital. Ultimately, then, what this means is that although we talk about the left and the right in Latin America, what really has emerged in the region is a two-dimensional competitive space. So there's a traditional left-right economic axis, where the left supports more redistributive and status policies, and the right supports private property and the marketplace. But there's also emerged another axis of political contestation that is cultural in character, that really is orthogonal to the left-right. And so you get political actors that are challenging traditional social hierarchies on race, on ethnicity, on gender. You find those kinds of challenges to the traditional social hierarchy on one cultural axis, and then you find the defenders of those traditional social hierarchies on the other axis. All right, so this cultural axis of contestation is increasingly being politicized both by actors on the left and by actors on the right. And this is in some ways reinforcing the political polarization that is taking place. So it's not just a polarization on the economic axis, but it's also a polarization on these cultural issues within the region. Just to try to wrap up in terms of where this leaves us today within Latin America, I think it's clear that Latin America has made significant gains in mass political inclusion over the last several decades, really as part of this so-called third wave of democratization since the 1980s, and especially since the late 1990s. There's really what some people call a second historical phase of mass political incorporation in Latin America. There was a first phase of incorporation with in the middle of the 20th century with the rise of populist figures like Perón or Cardenas in Mexico that mobilized working class support and brought the working class into the political arena. That was sort of the initial historical stage of mass political incorporation. In some ways, the region has gone through a second historical phase of mass political incorporation in recent decades. But what we see, however, is this mass political incorporation is very weakly institutionalized. Across the region, political parties are very weak. You see broad-based movements that are trying to form new political parties, but they're often very heavily dependent upon charismatic figures. And there's very, very little institutionalization of the political representation of these new popular constituencies. In fact, what we see within the region, it's much easier to turn people out on the streets to protest, right? To mobilize people as an opposition force. It's easy to mobilize people to protest. It is much, much more difficult to organize those people around some sort of governing platform. This is the challenge you see in the Chilean case, where you had this extraordinary mass mobilization against the status quo, against the Pinochet era constitution and the economic order he left behind. So there's been tremendous mobilization of society to protest, but very, very difficult. They have found it to be very difficult to try to translate that energy into the governing institutions through the Constituent Assembly, through the new Boric government, and to try to organize that support in a coherent way to support an alternative platform. Right, so the Chilean case is especially dramatic, but there's a version of that story that you see in Bolivia, in Ecuador. It's very much on the agenda in the Colombian case. So that's the process in a number of different countries. Finally, then, just to conclude, part of what we're seeing, I think, is a dynamic of mobilization and counter-mobilization within the region. You see mobilization at the grassroots on the left, but there's also counter-mobilization on the grassroots on the right as well. And so this is part of what lies behind the left versus right polarization in Latin America and the political stalemate that we seem to see in a number of different countries. So I think I'll probably leave it there. I've been talking long enough, and hopefully I've given you all a few ideas that we can open it up and have some questions and answers. I'm happy to to respond to any questions you might have or to hear your own thoughts about these issues. So I'll go ahead and stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was really a nice and wonderful lecture. And as I stated earlier as well to you, the topic which you chose, it was really interesting with the world seeing Latin America a new left turn, a pink tide, which has been a debate in Latin American politics. It's quite an interesting lecture. which you delivered. So before we, I have requested the audience to drop their questions in the chat box. We would definitely take as much as possible as time permits. And so before we go to the odd questions of our participants, as well as before we leave our floor to Ambassador Vargas, I would like to ask you a question, which I really wanted to ask. Like, the world is now much more polarized, and we have seen in terms of global politics, we have been seeing a great power competition between USA and China. The new left turn, the pink tide 2.0, whatever we call it, it's not the time during the period of the early times of this century, when world was not that polarized. We live in a society when we are seeing the growing rivalry of the new Cold War between USA and China. So how much is this great power competition affecting Latin American politics? So what would be your take on this? So
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's an important one, because certainly China has been an increasingly important economic power within the Latin American region. So there's when we talk about the commodity boom in Latin America, a lot of that is driven by the rise not just of China, but also India and other Asian countries as major export markets for Latin American commodities. So the Asian markets were very important in the commodity boom in Latin America. And even with the end of the commodity boom, those export markets are still critical for Latin American economies. There's also been a lot of Chinese investments in Latin America in mining and oil and gas activities, as well as financial investments in supporting some of the governments within the region. So increasingly you see China being a major player, both as an export market and as a financier of economic development strategies within Latin America. Now, part of what that means is Latin America is less economically dependent on the United States today than what they were historically. That's less the case for Mexico and Central America, which may remain more closely tied to the United States than South America is much less dependent on the United States today. In fact, Brazil, Chile, a number of South American countries trade more with China than they trade with the United States today, and they get more financing from China than they get from the United States. So in some ways, Latin America remains economically dependent, but their dependency has been diversified. They have more relations with Europe, and especially then with China and Asian countries, and they're less dependent upon the hegemon in the north, the United States, than what they used to be. So again, there's a little bit of difference, I think, between Mexico and Central America on one hand, and the South American countries with that. But in terms of the rivalry, I mean, I think to be honest, the United States is not paying a whole lot of attention to Latin America. The Trump administration was, I mean, Trump wanted to get rid of, Hugo Chavez and Maduro, and they wanted to bring about regime change in Venezuela. They were not able to do that. But Trump was, of course, Trump wanted to close off the border with Mexico. But otherwise, Trump is not paying a lot of attention to Latin America. And Biden, in theory, they'd like to give more attention, and of course they're worried about the border. So they need to come up with some sort of solution to the border crisis, and they don't have a solution to that. But Latin America is not getting a whole lot of attention from the U.S., from Washington. Washington is focused on the Ukraine, on Russia and China and the Middle East, and Latin America is kind of an afterthought. And we could debate whether that's good or bad for Latin America. To the extent that Latin America has not benefited from being in the sphere of influence of the United States, perhaps it's a good thing that the U.S. is distracted and looking elsewhere. It provides a little bit of political and economic autonomy for Latin America, perhaps. But at the end of the day, the U.S.-China rivalry is, part of the big picture of the global stage that affects other parts of the world. But I don't think we'll see the U.S.-China rivalry really being played out in a major way in Latin America. I think Latin America is likely to be a secondary plane for that superpower conflict, which I think is likely to be, to be expressed more directly in other parts of the world, especially in Asia.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now I would also like to make a question before we move to the chat. I would like to know, and for my question, I think also Ambassador Lajos might have some comments to make. I would like to understand, in the first wave that we saw of the new left wave Latin America, we saw the first wave without Colombia and Mexico. Now we see Colombia and Mexico participating in this new left wave. I would like to understand, how do you see regional politics playing out in this new scenario? And how do you see, if you see like more a tendency towards more cooperation between those governments? Because I always saw Mexico like very, for example, less integrated with the rest of Latin America and more integrated with North America, for example. How do you see those things playing out?
Yeah, I think, especially now with the election of Lula in Brazil, you will see Lula trying to reassert Brazil's leadership within the region in a way that encourages integration within the Latin American, within the Latin American region, and in a way which tries to assert their autonomy vis-a-vis the United States more. Although you're not going to see, I don't think, the kind of real strong challenge to U.S. hegemony that you saw with Hugo Chavez. I mean, Chavez had the most ambitious and comprehensive counter-hegemonic project that we've seen in modern times. I mean, Chavez made a real effort to build alternative regional institutions, an alternative to the OAS, an alternative development bank, alternative trade pacts, an alternative cable television network. I mean, he tried to create alternatives to the entire infrastructure that was set up under U.S. hegemony, and he was explicitly trying to challenge U.S. hegemony within the region and on the global stage. So he thought big. He had big ambitions, and he invested Venezuelan oil money to try to develop these institutions. Now, at the end of the day, most of this crumbled when Chavez died and the oil and the commodity boom went down, and Venezuela, of course, itself entered into crisis. I mean, you look at Venezuela today, they certainly are not in any position to exercise leadership within the region the way in which Hugo Chavez tried to do when he was there. For a while, you had in the first wave of the left turn, you had Lula and Bolsonaro, or Lula and Chavez, and these, in some ways, they coordinated and collaborated with each other to try to build these alternative regional institutions. So I think you'll see at least a little bit of a revival of that under Lula today, but it won't have kind of the sharp anti-imperial kind of tendency that you had, sort of the counter-hegemonic thrust that you had when Hugo Chavez was there. But even, I mean, there are meetings that have been going on now, with Lula reaching out to other regional leaders. There's even some talk of coming up with a South American currency as a common currency within South America. So I think you'll see Lula, as long as you've got the left Peronistas in office in Argentina, both Boric in Chile and Petro in Colombia are, sympathetic to some sort of broader regional kind of stand without necessarily being anti-US. I think Boric is very careful on that. But I think you will see more regional efforts at integration politically and economically under this sort of new set of leftist leaders than what we saw under the conservative leaders, who pretty much backed away from all of that. So I think we'll see kind of an intermediate, not quite returning to what you had under Hugo Chavez, but I think there will be some efforts to try to advance an integration process within the region.
Ambassador Vargas, would you like to ask Professor some questions?
Yes, thank you. I am very impressed with the presentation, which has covered ample ground. And I would just like to highlight some of the points that Professor Roberts made. First, referring to greater cooperation in the region, I see that happening within South America. Lula just announced the revival of the deceased UNASUR, and that means he wants again to leave Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean out of the picture. And it makes sense in terms of the South American countries being much more aligned as commodity exporters, whereas Mexico being mostly an exporter of industrial goods tightly linked to the United States and Canada within the production chains. So that is something that we'll probably see in the coming years if Lula has the strength, the institutional strength to do it, and overcome the internal weakness that has been shown by the clear necessity he had to fire the chief of the armed forces recently last week. I would also like to point out that Latin America being the most unequal region of the world, it's only logical that once we have democracy, and that's the good news, that we have democratic governments, no matter how weak they are, that the tendency would be to go to the left and look for a better distribution of the wealth. And I think, therefore, leftist governments are here to stay as long as we have democracy. And I hope we do clearly stay on this path. I would also like to emphasize the importance of the women's movement in all of Latin America. I am very happy for it, and I am very enthusiastic to see that the new generation of young women are really organizing and have a very strong voice. At this point in Mexico, with a very popular president that we have, the only organized groups that have gone to the streets and are young women. And you see that in Chile and in Argentina, they have even have these groups singing and organizing that are very attractive and that symbolize that women just don't want the traditional role assigned to them. And this is very revolutionary, because this means women are going to be having less children, and women are going to be demanding equality in salary and in labor conditions with men. And this is a very long-term change that we're going to see in the region, and the more, the better. The other point I have to make is with the importance of China, of trade with China, it's not only that trade dominates, and China is probably in the most South American countries, the first trading partner, but also it becomes a model of a successful non-democratic country. China has effectively pulled millions of people out of poverty, but it has not acquired or in any way shown signs of democracy. And while throughout history, the United States has been the model of democracy for all of for the rest of the Americas, for the good or for the bad, and for the opposition or for extreme admiration, today, as relations draw closer to China, it is impressive how people begin to look at China as a model of development and not necessarily a democratic one, and that is worrisome. The last thing I would like to mention is the importance of drugs. And of drugs, because the pattern has changed. Traditionally, as you mentioned, drugs were coming from South America, making their way through Central America and Mexico once the road through the Caribbean was closed by the US Navy in the 80s. And they made their way corrupting the regimes in Central America and Mexico. And therefore, we have an increased violence in this region that is very difficult to manage. But today, the appearance of fentanyl is a drug that is coming from China. And somehow the United States has been able to deter China from delivering directly the fentanyl or whatever it takes to do fentanyl from directly to the US, and it's coming through Mexico. It's coming through the Pacific ports in Mexico, and we have not been able to have that deterrence that the United States had. So again, the drug is coming through the Pacific and corrupting and making consumers out of many people who are involved in this trade in Mexico. And this is very dangerous because the nature of fentanyl is totally different from the nature of the previous drugs, cocaine or whatever. And although I agree with you that the United States has neglected Latin America historically, except for very few moments where there has been, Latin America has made enough trouble, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. Today, very discreetly, the Biden administration has begun negotiating with Cuba and Venezuela, and I think that's very positive, and I hope it continues. Yeah. And Professor, I am really overwhelmed by your presentation. It's so good, and you covered so much ground that this is all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Those are very good comments, and I completely agree. You've made some very good points. I didn't give a lot of attention to the role of women's movements, but that has been a huge part of of the story in countries like Argentina and Chile, Mexico and Colombia, and that is, it becomes part of the dynamic of of trying to push the democratic process forward in responding not just to economic inequalities, but to other kinds of social inequalities that exist in what are very hierarchical societies. And when we think of Latin America being the world's most unequal region, there's an economic or a social class side to that story, but the patriarchal character of Latin American societies becomes parts of it as well. And it's important to keep that in mind. And that's why when I talk about sort of the two different dimensions, sort of the cultural axis and the economic axis, that's part of what's going on is movements that are pushing back against these other social hierarchies to try to bring about more social equality within Latin America. Yeah, thank you for your comments.
So we would also like to go through few questions which has been asked from the participants. So this question is from Adarsh Tripathi. So the question is, the worsening economic scenario, which is one of the reasons for this frequent left and right turn in South America, we are not seeing any end without working on it. Is there any effective model for it, or simply how can it be countered? Yes.
I'm sorry, effective model for responding to which challenge was it?
The worsening economic scenario.
Oh, I see it now. Yeah. Yeah, this is a difficult question and an important one. And as I said, I alluded to this in my presentation. I think one of the failures of the left government, sort of that first left turn that I talked about, they really did not have an alternative economic development model that they proposed. They certainly supported more social programs, to try to, programs extending pension plans. They rose wages in many countries. There were new poverty relief programs, family assistance programs. So they basically tried to expand the welfare state and, to support what you might think of as social citizenship rights within Latin America. So there was certainly progress on those fronts. But in terms of sustainable patterns of economic growth and development, very little economic diversification or new industrialization that took place. In some ways, the leftist governments reinforced the dependence of the region on commodity exports. And that's the sort of the core of Latin American economic development since the colonial period, has been colonial exports. And the whole logic of import substitution industrialization in the middle of the 20th century was to try to move beyond that and to have autonomous processes of industrialization taking place. And there was some success with that in the middle of the last century, but basically that's the model that entered into crisis in the 1980s and 1990s. And Latin America has now turned back towards a reliance on commodity exports. It's a very different model of development from what Asia has pursued, for example, where Asia has focused more on trying to move up the ladder towards higher value added forms of manufacturing production and competing with higher wage labor in terms of innovation, technological change, so moving up the production chain. And Latin America has not effectively followed that path. You see little pockets of it in Costa Rica and Chile, but basically the region remains dependent on exporting copper and oil and soybeans and natural gas. And what that means is you're likely to have these boom and bust cycles. You get periods when the commodity prices are high and the economies grow rapidly, and states can capture some of those rents and put them into social programs and people are happy. But that tends not to be a very sustainable, or it tends not to be a stable model of economic development. And so I think the region is still struggling over that and trying to look for other ways to insert itself in global markets where they can take advantage of the natural resources to try to become more competitive and productive in other areas as well. But I think the region is still struggling to come up with that kind of model.
So, Ambassador Vargas, would you like to comment on any model which can help Latin America to overcome economic scenario as well as the inequalities?
Today, research has shown that the import substitution model came into a crisis and the effects were long-lasting. We have escaped from that and in Mexico through linking our economy to North America. And in that sense, we have not achieved the growth we were expecting when we took this path because of the eruption of China. Many of the investments that could have gone, or we were hoping that would come to Mexico, have went to China. Today, with the growing competition between the United States and China and the decoupling of the economies, and also with economic sanctions imposed on Russia, we are looking forward for a greater investment in the North American region. We just had a couple of weeks ago the Three Amigos meeting of the presidents of Mexico, the United States, and the Prime Minister of Canada, looking forward to create a more competitive region in North America. And this, of course, is very promising for Mexico and probably for Central America and the Caribbean, where many of this production can expand. But I don't see what alternative model there can be for South America, which, as Professor Roberts has said, they have not been doing anything special to go away from being a product, from producing commodities. It's very difficult to think what's the alternative for them.
So now if we see like China is the main, like according to you, would you argue like China is not an ally, rather could be more of a like debt trap diplomacy might be going on in the region of Latin America due to the BRI and all?
Well, I mean, certainly some of the Latin American countries, some of the South American countries in particular, have looked to China, both for, diplomatically and certainly economically. And as I said, both in terms of trade relationships and in terms of international financing. And so I think those relationships are likely to continue. I mean, one of the reasons why South America likes having relationships with China tends to be, they tend not to put a lot of conditions on Latin American governments, saying that you have to pursue this set of economic policies, or you have to meet these particular political criteria for democracy, or, I mean, China tends to deal with governments as they are, and China's economic development model itself is rather heterodox. I mean, it's a mixture of the state and the market. And so China's pretty comfortable dealing with Latin American governments that have a mixture of the state and the market, whereas Washington tends to expect to see the marketplace and the private sector in the lead. And so, in some ways, the Chinese model of development lends itself to the kind of heterodox policies and strategies that you see, especially where left-wing governments are in power in Latin America, where, the state, they may still be exporting oil and gas and copper and soybeans, but the role of the state in setting the terms of investment, in taxing multinational corporations. One of the leftist governments are still exporting commodities, but they're putting higher taxes on or royalties on multinational corporations that are investing in mines or oil and gas. And so they're capturing more of the revenues and using those revenues for social programs. That was sort of the model of Evo Morales in Ecuador, in Bolivia, and Correa in Ecuador. So there's some of that going on, and China's been willing to work with those governments and to accept the kinds of policies that they're adopting. So I think this is part of what makes China an attractive partner for some of the South American countries. Is there, it's not like the 1980s and 1990s where Washington was saying, all right, we'll support you for debt relief, but here are the conditions you have to follow. All right, so the whole notion of conditionality, you have to privatize the industries, you have to shrink the state, you have to cut social programs. Those kinds of conditions were very politically difficult for Latin America when they were trying to get financial relief from Washington. And China is willing to do business usually without setting those kinds of terms, although that doesn't necessarily mean that, it doesn't necessarily mean that China has the best interests of the Latin American countries at heart when they're doing business. But for the most part, they are flexible with governments in the kinds of conditions that are established for doing business.
Yes, they are flexible, but they are very opaque in terms of financing. And it's very difficult to find out how enterprises or infrastructure that is being financed by China is under which conditions. Yeah,
that's right. Good point.
And also, if we see the Chinese BRI projects, and the projects are always being led by Chinese government. So this is one of the concern what Washington has always raised, that China is always, whenever trying to establish any projects in any region, not only for Latin America, but their concern is always the political dominance or the political influence which they are trying to spread. So yeah.
Now these are sort of the deeper questions. I mean, it's one, when you realize that the economic relationships are serving a broader set of international agendas and trying to understand what it means in terms of the alignment of forces at the global stage is important to keep in mind.
I would like to go to another question from our participant. It is from Anjali Kumari. So it is to Professor Roberts. As you mentioned that the period between 2003 to 2013 was the best period for Latin America economically. But does that mean that the financial crisis of 2008, which impacted many economies throughout the world, had little impact on economics of Latin America? Although I could see in your graphic representation rise in commodities price in 2008, but would you like to shed some light on that?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. You know, there's a long saying in Latin America. They always said when the U.S. economy catches cold, Latin America gets pneumonia. And in other words, any financial crisis in the U.S. is likely to be magnified in Latin America. The 2008 crisis, 2008-2009 crisis, when Wall Street, you know, basically self-destructed and had to be bailed out by Washington, and that affected Latin America. So there was a dip in 2008. If you that the one slide I showed, the commodity prices, the commodity prices, of course, come down sharply in 2008, 2009, but they came back up pretty quickly. And Latin America rebounded, most of Latin America rebounded pretty quickly from the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And in fact, some countries didn't even go into recession. They slowed down. So the rapid economic growth, the 2000, 2006, 2007, right? The rapid growth came down, but they didn't necessarily sink into recession. In some countries like Chile, for example, where the socialist governments under Lagos and Bachelet, they, you know, during the commodity boom, they weren't spending all of that money. They were putting some of those revenues were going into sort of a rainy day account, which they could use to cushion the impact of the financial crisis when it came. And so when the financial crisis came, they were spending money to cushion the impacts so that the recession was not more severe. So for the version of that story, I think in Brazil as well. All right, so ultimately, the 2008-2009 global crisis, it had its effects in Latin America. It brought down commodity prices, it slowed down economic growth, and it pushed a few countries into recession. But it was not a severe crisis. The region was able to come out of it pretty quickly. And they came out of it and they continued to grow quite rapidly for a couple of years until the 2014, you know, when the commodity prices came down in 2014, they stayed down for quite a while. And so this new period of economic stagnation sets in after 2014. All right, but from 2009 through 2013, the economies grew again pretty rapidly until 2014. I should point out with the pandemic, right, the global economic fallout of the pandemic has hit Latin America very hard. And so the region is still struggling to recover. And of course, the health effects, Peru had the highest per capita death rate from COVID in the world. Ecuador was also very severely hit. So a number of Latin American countries, in part reflecting the severe inequalities and the severe inequalities in terms of healthcare access, the region was hit very hard by the COVID pandemic and the economic fallout from that. And that's part of all this anti-incumbent voting that we're seeing. Governments are unpopular pretty much almost across the board. The big exceptions, the most popular governments in Latin America today, it's Bukele in El Salvador and it's Lopez Obrador in Mexico. Right? Those are the two, both sort of populist type figures, one leaning left, the other leaning right. But they are the two most popular governments in Latin America today, at least the ones that have been in power for a little while. There's always a honeymoon for people that have just taken office. But basically, most governments in Latin America have been struggling with the effects of the pandemic and the economic crisis. And this is part of why governments are unpopular just about across the board within the region.
There is one more question. This is probably on the political behavior of Latin America. This is also from Anjali Kumari. Yes. So the question is, good evening, sir. Thank you for this amazing informative lecture. My question to you is, we see that most of the populist parties or governments attract voters by offering them freebies or the popular demands, but not solid structural changes. So are the political institutions or political parties to be blamed for such approach, or the voters should also be held accountable? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's one thing to provide some sort of benefit to voters, but if that isn't done in a way that is sustainable, then it's irresponsible on the part of governments probably to do it, and it's certainly not very far thinking on the part of voters to think that they can that those kinds of programs are going to be to their benefit. And of course, the voters always assume that that the programs will remain there when they may not be. And you look at the Venezuelan case. I mean, clearly Chavez was providing a wide range of social benefits that were only sustainable as long as the oil money was there and commodity prices were very high. And indeed, there was tremendous inefficiency in the delivery of the social programs in Venezuela, a lot of corruption and just institutional inefficiency that tends to be tightly linked to oil in particular. All right. So oil states, we always think that oil means you've struck gold and you're going to be rich forever. And the reality is oil tends to be it distorts local economies, it corrupts the state, it weakens institutions in ways that tend not to lend themselves to sustainable development. But other kinds of social programs, you look at things like the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, which actually began under the centrist government of Cardoso, but it was expanded by Lula when he came in 2002, and really provided significant benefits to a quarter of the Brazilian population. All right, a large number of people who received some benefits from the Bolsa Familia. It didn't really cost a lot of money. It's a fraction of what the Brazilian state pays in the pension program for the middle and upper classes. And so this poverty relief program was not terribly expensive, and frankly, it was quite sustainable financially. The political debate around it, when Bolsonaro comes in, it gets complicated. But basically, that was a form of state support for the poor that I think was financially sustainable. And I think the challenge for the region is to figure out what can you do, what are the kinds of programs that can be adopted that are sustainable financially, that do have a meaningful difference for people's lives. And I think, there has been some success in identifying what some of those programs might look like. But sustaining it politically is sometimes more difficult than sustaining it economically. I think that's part of what we're seeing.
Exactly. And we would like to wrap up. But before that, I would like to ask a last question. And this is to both Professor Roberts as well as Ambassador Vargas. And the question is, like, in your lecture, you had mentioned that, when it comes to the left parties or even the conservative parties of right, what lacks in Latin American politics is homogeneity, which Europe has when it comes to the pan-European movement. So when do you think that Latin America can, I know it's very difficult to say because it's a second pink tide, and it's in a still very early stage, but is it possible for Latin America to ever achieve the pan-American movement or the complete unity? And how successful would this pink tide be in Latin America? So yes.
Yeah, it's a challenging question. Latin America has been striving for political unity since, for over 200 years, since the independence movement led by Simón Bolívar. Bolívar's dream was to have a United States of South America. But of course, when independence was achieved, the territorial and administrative divisions of the Spanish colonies ended up becoming independent nation states. And so the Spanish Empire fragmented into all the sovereign states. But I think we've seen several efforts. Certainly there was the efforts during the first left turn. And now, we do see some efforts, in particular with Lula there now, there's some efforts to try to coordinate on a regional scale, at least within South America. And I don't think we're going to see something quite, something as ambitious as the European common market emerging, or a common currency, but there are some discussions underway, and I think there are some efforts to try to coordinate both politically and economically. And I think there are certainly possibilities to move forward. So I think Latin America is a long way from achieving the kind of unity that you've seen in Europe. And of course, even in Europe, it remain a lot of questions around that, with Britain pulling out and other things in recent years. But I think there seems to be an association between the governments of the left and efforts to try to integrate and coordinate both politically and economically on a regional level. And so I think that'll probably continue in the years ahead.
I agree with that. Yet we have a very strong cultural bond, because most countries share one language, and Portuguese is very close to Spanish. So we do share the same literature, and we do share the same mind frame. So that's a very difficult way to measure the unity of Latin America, but it exists, and there's still a very special relationship with Spain and Portugal. But on the other hand, we have to wait and see what the geopolitical realities bring. Wars and Cold War have brought closer together, a tighter knit in the core of the continent. And we hope there's no Third World War for sure. And we hope that whatever comes in this new decade will not resemble the Cold War of the past. Yet it is a possibility, and that will certainly grow tighter the whole continent.
Yeah, we would definitely see, as it is very too early to predict, and we know this is very thin pink tide, which scholars have been talking post elections, the left turns in Latin America, and we would definitely see how it goes and how the governments are successful in this region. And we hope for the best, and we hope that someday Latin America achieves unity like the Europe, which we were discussing, and there would be more homogeneity in the region when it comes to politics of Pan-American movement. Yeah. So thank you so much. I would like to thank everyone for joining this wonderful session, and thank you to Professor Roberts for joining us for this for our first Latin American event, this program. It was indeed a wonderful lecture that you shared with us today evening, and we are really grateful for accepting our invitation. And thank you to Ambassador Vargas as well for joining us today and engaging with us for a wonderful discussion. We are really thankful, and we would be happy for future collaborations, and we hope for the best of our Latin America program at CGC. Yes.
Good luck.
Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure meeting with you.